Hi, everyone. Welcome to Data and the Greater Good. I am Mara Fields. Usually Elaine is hosting these. She's unable to join us this evening, so I'll be taking over. And then also we have Bill Prickett with us, who is recording. And tonight we'll be hearing from Roseanne Haggerty from Community Solutions. And I'll just do a bit of intro about Community Solutions and Roseanne herself, and then she'll take it away. So Community Solutions is a nonprofit based in New York City whose mission is to end homelessness by partnering with cities and counties to build accountability for results. Community Solutions is demonstrating that homelessness is a solvable problem. With data-driven approaches, Community Solutions has proven homelessness can be rare and brief. It has transformed the lives of thousands across the country through its Built for Zero movement of more than 90 cities and counties working to end homelessness. Roseanne Haggerty is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Community Solutions. She is an internationally recognized leader in developing innovative strategies to end homelessness and strengthen communities. Community Solutions assists communities throughout the US and internationally in solving the complex housing problems facing their most vulnerable residents. Their large-scale change initiatives include the 100,000 Homes and Built for Zero campaigns to end chronic and veteran homelessness, and neighborhood partnerships that bring together local residents and institutions to change the conditions that produce homelessness. Earlier, she founded Common Ground Community, a pioneer in the design and development of supportive housing and research-based practices that end homelessness. Thank you so much for being with us, Roseanne.
Great. Well, thank you, Maura and Bill, and thanks everyone who's here for your interest in this topic. And really thrilled to have a chance to walk you through our work, because especially given the purpose of this organization, we actually have a lot in common, which is, in our case, discovering that the key to ending homelessness is really understanding by name in real time who exactly is experiencing this dynamic problem and helping communities to build essentially operating systems that can reduce the fragmentation that vulnerable people face and getting the services and help they need, and move very steadily using quality improvement practices to a place that we call functional zero, where homelessness is measurably rare, quickly detected when new housing crises occur, and rapidly resolved. So I'm going to lead you a bit through our journey and try to buzz as quickly as possible through the slides so we can have more time for discussion. But what I've done is, just knowing the orientation of the group, just tried to pick out some of the ways in which we're using data, and to reveal just how frankly solvable this problem is once you have a deeper data-driven understanding of it. So just to start with the headline, as Maura mentioned, we now work in almost 100 communities, typically, well, sometimes just a city, but typically a county or a cluster of counties, a whole region. These are all communities that have voluntarily joined this movement and have adopted this approach because frankly, they've seen what they were doing wasn't working. And what's so exciting is since 2015, when we launched this particular phase of our work, we now have 44 communities that are measurably reducing homelessness, 14 that have sustainably ended homelessness for one or more populations. And I will keep coming back to this other number, 62 communities now that know by name in real time everyone who's experiencing homelessness, so they have this comprehensive dynamic picture of the issue, which is the key to taking effective action and actually to moving to a place where this problem is solved community by community. And not to forget that at the end of the day, it's individuals whose lives are being transformed. And so even though we're looking at communities that are getting to zero, communities, of course, are tracking those individuals who are sustainably housed. And that's now over 139,000 people, basically using housing that already existed, but housed because systems are now self-aware, data-driven, and actually moving toward results. And so, Maura, if you could move to the next slide. This is basically a bit of our journey, and it's in some ways very representative of how we're hoping the field moves. We started off, and I initially started one organization, one not-for-profit, that focused on building housing for people experiencing homelessness and the working poor. And while having more and more specially designed housing that with support services involved is critical, we found that it was insufficient, that we were building more and more housing, and homelessness in New York was going up and up. And so it's just like, wait a minute, what do we really have a solution here if it's not able to reach everyone, or the fragmentation? One of the things that was the turning point in that whole journey toward, like, we've got a good solution, and that's basically where most people think the solution needs to begin, which is more housing. It was proving like not scalable and not actually even reaching people we saw in our own community. We were building a lot of this housing in Midtown Manhattan, and we were passing many of the same individuals on the street who were seemingly beyond our help when we started building this housing. So just like, wait a minute, this is not adding up. And so the most, I think, catalytic thing that we ever did in terms of shifting our approach was we pulled together everyone working on homelessness in the community, and it was crazy, like a 20-block area in Times Square. There are something like 17 organizations, and we didn't really regularly speak with each other, plus these city agencies. And then we invited everyone together along with some of the individuals on the street experiencing homelessness, saying, like, what gives? What does it take to get someone out of homelessness? And how do we actually use our resources differently? And this design exercise that we conjured up proved just incredibly revealing, because what you're seeing is what it takes, and what we all figured out in that one place initially, what it takes for one person to get through all of the hurdles and all of the different administrative steps that involve multiple organizations in order, perhaps at the end of the day, to move into stable housing again. And those yellow Post-its indicated places where contracts or money had to change hands between organizations in order to keep people moving. But essentially, no one was aware how this all added up, how their piece in the system connected with others. And no one saw that we basically had created this situation of impossibility for vulnerable people to ever get the critical help they needed. We just, they're filling out forms and waiting in line all the time. And so it was against this backdrop of, wait a minute, like, this begins to explain why we can have lots of resources going into homelessness and very poor results, because no one was accountable for seeing that homelessness was being reduced. We were all fulfilling contract obligations or pursuing our own mission, which was housing or outreach. But what we saw we needed was an operating system that tied all this together, that really started with, like, who's responsible for reducing and ending homelessness? And Maura, if you could go to the next slide. This gives you a sense of just how serious and pervasive the challenge that I just showed in that illustration is. Across the country, this is typical. In any community, you have like 15, 20, not just organizations, but different players, multiple not-for-profits, but different public agencies, hospitals, criminal justice system, all of these different players who all are touching the problem. But in no community that we saw when we started trying to figure out this work was anyone organized, at a community level to get to population level results. Everyone was doing their worthy thing, and none of it was adding up. And so, Maura, if you can go to the next slide. What really became the driving question for us, and really kind of to pivot into the data story, we could see that the fundamental question wasn't being asked in any community, which is all of our activity, all of our investments adding up to the outcome, the result that we would all say we want, which is less homelessness, getting to an end to homelessness. And also that it took us, that kind of Chutes and Ladders slide, it took us well over 10 years of doing really good housing work to start asking the right questions. So it's just like, how do we get to a place where we could know, in close to real time, whether our hypotheses about what needs to happen here are actually true? And so this is the beginning of the journey, and making us basically a data-driven organization and understanding homelessness is fundamentally a data and knowledge problem. So Maura, if you could go to the next slide. Just note the headline. This is in the Burlington, Vermont area. Every year there is, and it just happened 2 weeks ago, every community across the country that receives HUD funds for homelessness is expected to do what's called a point-in-time count. Just go out, do an estimate. You don't get people's names. You just check to see how many people are sleeping outside or in shelters on that night. You might attach some kind of multiple to that, all sorts of different random methods. And then about 18 months later, sometimes a little sooner, it's happened as quickly as 14 months, the federal government publishes the results of this point-in-time count. So the data is old, the data is a guesstimate, and yet this becomes the story in any community, like, oh my God, in Chittenden County, we had a 24% increase. And then, typically, communities race to like, oh, we need to, build more shelters. We need to do this. We need to do that. But actually, if you can go to the next slide, Maura, what we found after working with Chittenden County, once they joined Built for Zero for a year, that 24% increase is basically normal variation. They were basically making all sorts of policy decisions and moving resources around, and they didn't have a good understanding of what was actually going on whatsoever. So it's a way of basically highlighting this fact, like, to solve a complex problem, you basically need a 360 real-time view of it. And so that's where our Built for Zero work begins. Maura, if you could go to the next slide. What we learned, and now we're at this for 7 years, was that the way to start getting to this place of having a 360-degree view, having all of the players in the community actually working toward a shared end state, requires 5 things. And so I'm going to sort of unpack them as we go. But first, and again, all of this is driven by data. You need a shared aim, and that one that can be measured. So what we do is help communities pull together the critical players in government and the not-for-profit sector around and facilitate them getting to agreement that everybody's going to be working together to get to functional zero homelessness. And we typically start with veteran or chronic homelessness. And now a lot of communities are widening out to like all single adults, all families. But to start with, like, we're all here solving the same problem, and how are we going to measure progress? And so that really is the glue we find to getting a collaborative, this nimble command center team together. And that this group of actors, not-for-profit and government actors, they need to start acting like they do in like case of a natural disaster. Basically seeing that the job is to solve the problem, not to do what they were doing just to comply with a contract, and to begin working as a team as opposed to separate agencies. And again, it's the data that becomes the common truth and the grease to this system, because this by name real-time data, and I'll say more as we go about how that's created, becomes the shared truth. That what's the picture we all see together and agree is real about how homelessness is playing out in our community, and what the dynamics are in terms of inflow and outflow, and where the places are in the system that by intervening differently, we could see the greatest result in terms of a reduction in homelessness. And so data becomes the driver of activity, you can just see the kind of shift in worldview from, we're going to take a guesstimate once a year and we're going to figure out what that was 18 months later, to like actually looking at data on who's experiencing homelessness that is updated at least monthly. And in most communities, they're updating the data weekly. But then we help communities put together, and across these 98 communities, we have a very robust learning network. What is each community learning that could be informing the other? And so codifying and documenting these change packages. And lastly, ironically, this is where we started off in our journey. That's where you need to figure out what kind of housing and other resources you need. You don't necessarily start with the housing. The housing is an input to this larger system. So this is basically probably what I would like you most to remember. This is what success involves in communities that are getting on the way to zero and who have gotten to zero for one or more populations. But let me unpack that by going through the deck more. If you can go to the next slide. So you have to start with a shared aim. And what communities who join Built for Zero sign on to is you're going to get to functional zero, which is basically a public health measure. It means that you've built a system that stays ahead of the problem. That doesn't mean that no one will ever experience homelessness again in your community, but it's going to be increasingly rare because you're going to flip the type of activity you're engaged in from endless response to knowledge-based and data-informed prevention activities. And so fewer and fewer people are becoming homeless, and you're basically building your system so that you are preventing almost all homelessness, quickly identifying new individuals and families who are falling into housing crises and resolving those within 30 days. So functional zero means staying ahead of the problem. And there are different, it's interesting. Homelessness is in many ways too big a label for the different ways in which individuals and groups experience homelessness. But functional zero is a concept. Again, it's just like we're sort of at functional zero measles in the country. Like we are functional zero, undrinkable drinking water. Just what it looks like to stay ahead of a problem and have a system that is actually high performing. So we'll go to next, Amora, what the nimble team looks like. And again, I mentioned, picture what a community would put in place after a flood or some kind of natural disaster. You're basically, it's not like my program versus your program anymore, at least if you're going to make any progress and stabilizing your community. You're all solving the same problem, working on the same set of facts, and you're iterating your responses as conditions and information changes. And so it's very much kind of a shifting of power as well, where it's basically hierarchy doesn't matter. What matters is, are we making progress together toward the goal? It requires some deft facilitation sometimes, but it's really kind of a new way of working that I think for most people who begin working this way in the communities we support feel is long overdue. That this, like, what does it look like to collaborate? How do we develop these new practices and habits and begin to think about the bigger picture, not just our own organization. Next slide, please. So here's like the heart of how the data comes together. This by name real-time data, basically, we help communities take what they have and make it, increase the quality and bring all of the kind of loose pieces of information together. Very frequently, there'll be the handful of organizations receiving HUD funding who are required to use this really clunky old, data system called Homeless Management Information System. And then there are groups that don't receive federal resources who don't input data. And even the data that's in the system, sometimes it's a situation where like we'll get around to putting the data in, like when we have our intern here in January. It's a mess is usually the place where communities start, but we help them take what they have, put it together, and then basically, help. What we know basically constitutes quality data is if communities can answer about 20 questions that go to high data quality standards. And so you start with kind of like what you got, and then you bring everyone who's working with people experiencing homelessness into the community to really refine the data. It usually means that you have to start investing in outreach services if those are underfunded. You need to persuade into being part of that community team some of the organizations who may be off doing their own thing. But this process is now, we've kind of gotten it so refined that typically it's about a 4-month process for communities to begin, taking these odd pieces of data and really creating a robust dynamic list that becomes the locus of the problem solving work that goes on. Let's go to the next slide. Some of the assessment questions go to basically quality, reliability, and frequency. So I'm sure given this group, we could spend a lot of time on this slide alone, but it really forces communities to reckon with how they're organized and whether they have a system that has all of the connective tissue in place, whether they can consistently and in a timely way, answer all of these questions around newly identified people, whether people's status is updated, whether they've been housed or they're waiting for services to be delivered. All of these moving parts have to actually be coming together in a single place. And this, this data standards process and tool has become just kind of a very different way for communities to even understand the problem they're working on. And what I can do is, by the way, since I'm buzzing through this, if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to share the deck afterwards. Let's go to the next slide, please, Maura. What communities usually use then after putting their data together is essentially this dashboard, and you'll see that it has many different layers, but this is what communities now see like they need to be paying attention to around homelessness, not having debates about programs or funding or ideological views alone. They have their place, but if you want to be actually reducing and ending homelessness, this is what you've got to be looking at, and everybody who's got a piece of the responsibility. Every week, who's actively homeless, what has happened in the course of that week in terms of people returning to homelessness who'd have been assisted before, people coming into homelessness who for the first time who'd never touched these systems before, and people returning from a status of sort of being inactive or sort of being off the radar screen, because people move in and out of this condition. And I think until we collectively figured this out, that you need this dynamic data picture, people would be holding like a rental voucher for someone who had been, whose name had been recorded on a waiting list a year ago, and they'd since moved on and hadn't been seen. And yet people may come back into needing assistance. And so basically communities now have data that is as flexible as the problem. So you're looking at inflow, you're asking new questions about, like, if someone has returned to homelessness after having been assisted in housing, like what didn't work? Was it a problem with the landlord? Did the individual need more mental health or other support? If someone is new into homelessness, and this is where the beginning of wisdom begins as far as how we actually start putting our resources in prevention. You're now disaggregating the experience of homelessness so that you can ask better questions and find out what failed, what services or support wasn't in place for that individual or family, and how could the community tighten things up so that others in similar states of vulnerability wouldn't tip into homelessness in the future. And again, I mentioned having a provision for like not holding resources for those who may have resolved their homelessness themselves, which is actually happens quite frequently, but neither are you losing sight of those individuals and families should they come back. But then outflow, you're also looking at how do we accelerate our housing placements? What can we be testing with our data and using quality improvement strategies to expand, our access to existing housing, to streamline and improve, the connection points so that people move through the system more quickly, and how many people are sort of off the radar screen because they haven't been seen in 2 to 3 months, and we can assume, until proven otherwise, that they may have resolved the situation on their own. So this is basically the problem statement and the resource that communities are using week after week, month after month. Next slide, please. And so I think I've kind of been making this point, but having data not just helps you solve the problem. You can triage your resources and improve your system. But what has also been really powerful, we've seen, and I think it's especially important now with all of these federal resources through the American Recovery Act, is that you kind of know where your problems are and where new housing or new mental health resources or new outreach resources can make a difference in improving outcomes for your particular community. And so we've seen really how powerful it is in terms of building public confidence and bringing people on board in a community to have like this really robust, convincing picture of the issue that no longer looks unsolvable because it's been dimensioned and the dynamics are now visible to anyone who's looking at the data. So we can go to the next slide, please. So just this now, lots of data slides that we've teamed up with the Tableau Foundation. They've been amazing partners to essentially equip each of our communities with access to these dashboards that help communities actually not just manage information as far as our individuals moving through the system quickly, but is the system itself shifting? Are we seeing just consistent reductions and the evidence manifest in these, as you see the run chart here, that communities are actually getting to a place where the system itself is now performing at a state of equilibrium. And it's been fascinating. And our team, what does Community Solutions do? We basically get everybody on board with a new way of working in these communities who step up. But we also train the local teams, that command center team and line staff, in data analytics, in quality improvement. We help them actually begin to approach this issue with an entirely new lens, and to move toward this view of a system shift rather than a program level outcome alone. So Maura, maybe to the next slide, please. This also gives you a sense, like the kind of the tools, how powerful they are for directing collective activity toward an end state. Communities now, with this Tableau system, can look not just at whether the number is going down, but they can basically dive into the specifics of the data about what is the nature of an increase in inflow or outflow, and again, these kind of very highly specific data points are the launching pad for communities figuring out, like, over the next month, what's our hypothesis about how to, for instance, reduce the rate of returns to homelessness, because that signals that there's probably a problem with landlords or services. But without this data, communities could easily be chasing the wrong inference. They could be like, oh, we have an increase in veteran homelessness. We've got to, just get more landlords. Actually, maybe you have enough landlords involved. You just have to make sure that they're more successful. And so the data actually points towards the actual problems that need to be solved at a given point in time to keep those reductions and system shifts on track. So if we can go to the next slide. Just giving you a sense of, like, some of our larger communities in Built for Zero. We have a really, I just think it's incredibly compelling array of communities: large, small, urban, large urban, rural, suburban, entire states, different political leanings. And what's been so compelling is just to see that these ideas about how you organize the system and how you organize groups of people to solve complex problems together, they work at every scale and in very different contexts. I'm just highlighting here some of our larger cities, but I think you're all familiar with, like, Jacksonville, vast geographically, Detroit, just enormous, kind of financial and governance challenges historically, but making incredible progress. District of Columbia, again, still major challenges with homelessness, but making incredibly steady progress on veteran and family homelessness in particular, and building a system that's going to get them to a place of functional zero. I'd be happy to take questions now. I've gone through that quickly, but I am eager to hear what your thoughts and questions are.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roseanne. That was such a compact presentation. There's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of data points and sort of all these agencies. So while I give people a minute to put their questions in the chat or ask you to expand on anything you had talked about, I had a question in wondering what you think. What are the causes of veteran homelessness? I think some people would not necessarily assume that's a large population, kind of thinking if you've served this country, wouldn't there be some services in place to prevent that?
Yeah. It's a great question, Maura, because actually veteran homelessness and the fact that it exists just is sort of like the biggest proof point that this is mainly a coordination and accountability problem in the country. Over the last 12 years, there's been an enormous push from the VA and Congress to end veteran homelessness. And rental subsidy vouchers, case management resources have been supplied in more than adequate number to get to that goal. There's still an estimated between 37 and 1,000 and 40,000 veterans experiencing homelessness. And Built for Zero communities, we can tell you exactly how many, but in many communities, it's still that kind of estimate. But overall, that's the range. So like you ask, like, how is it possible that individuals who served our country and have struggled afterwards in this terrible way are still on the street? Well, it's getting those resources connected to the individuals who need them. And if you're in a world where, or in a community where there are dozens of different services, none of them working together, that's how it happens. And the VA has many of the resources that they can channel, but they don't control housing. They don't actually have outreach teams typically. And so, homelessness by its nature requires a great deal of collaboration, but the funding sources have not necessarily in any way, recognized the essential collaborative nature of the problem. But this is a problem, particularly veteran homelessness, that should be solved and really does rely on, kind of building systems that connect the dots in communities. And I guess the other part of your question, Maura, was why and how do veterans become homeless? They're as a group, not unlike other vulnerable people, but I think before this big push that began during the Obama administration, you did have just a very significant overrepresentation of veterans in the homeless population. And some of that had to do, you can tell from the research, PTSD, basically very poor, which since improved, but not perfect, moments of handoff as people left the military and moved into civilian life, going from a highly structured environment to one where maybe your skill credentials didn't translate that naturally into civilian employment. And so this problem was shameful. I mean, I think veterans represented at that point something like 1% of the overall population and 21% of those experiencing homelessness. It's since shifted as evidence that intentional effort, resources actually solves this problem. But the work is far from done, though proceeding with just real rigor and success in Built for Zero communities.
Yeah. Aaron, did you put a hand up? Did you have a question you want to ask Roseanne?
Yes. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm a veteran myself, and I kind of have some firsthand experience with the homelessness and how they can get lost in the system. Start the video. And my question for Rosanna was, what are you guys doing to collect data from cross agencies in regards into clinics, police station reports, hospitals? Is there anything going on to somewhat track some of the homeless individuals across different agencies?
Great question. Yes, but not enough. I'll tell you, it really is very community dependent, Aaron, in terms of who they've pulled around that table. We are, I think the key thing, as communities begin to widen out from, working on, initially veteran and chronic homelessness, is to get the healthcare systems involved, is to get the criminal justice system involved, is to get the foster care system involved, is to get the courts involved who are handling eviction cases. Right now, basically every community has to get this level of data sharing, even between organizations working on homelessness, requires basically the consent, a HIPAA compliant release so that all of those agencies can share data, and the individual whose data is being input has to sign that. It's entirely possible. 98 communities are doing it. A lot of folks say, oh, we can't share data. Some people actually believe that it actually ends up being an excuse not to get help to people who need it. And yeah, but this question of how to get better data sharing agreements in place with healthcare systems and other systems, we're chipping away at it. It's a big mountain to climb, because a lot of these, especially these healthcare systems, think the world will end if they actually share data, or with homelessness systems. But there are a whole group of healthcare systems who've realized how vital it is for them to also be taking account of the social determinants of health, people's housing status. And so I'm hoping within the year we'll have some breakthroughs with some major healthcare systems who are working on this problem with us, of having system sharing arrangements that, again, HIPAA compliant and yet bring into play the ability to share data with local homelessness systems.
Thanks so much for your question,
Thank
Erin.
you.
That's a great question. Lee, did you have a question for Roseanne?
Sorry, I was unmuting. Well, thanks for the great presentation. I learned so much, and this the crisis, of homelessness has been on my mind for quite some time. And being a New York resident or in and around New York, I was wondering, what is the plan with respect to New York? I mean, is there, what are the roadblocks? Is the major roadblock that nonprofits and government agencies are hesitant to share data? And you're sort of trying to chip at it, and it's a work in progress?
Well, it's a very good question. We don't work with New York City, that is, the Buffalo area and Nassau, Suffolk County. Those communities are part of Built for Zero. But as I mentioned earlier, it's an entirely voluntary commitment to actually move from working on compliance, just we're going to spend our money in the way like HUD won't recapture it, or fulfill some other rules, versus changing the way we work so that we're all holding each other accountable for ending homelessness. And in New York City, you have a particularly daunting task. New York City has, for like 40 years, had a law, a consent decree in place that mandates the right to shelter. And so it's given rise to a vast shelter system that the city has spent. I think last year it was $3.2 billion, just building and operating shelters. And so all of the city's activity is in complying with the right to shelter, as opposed to what do we have to do to get everyone onto the same page to prevent and end homelessness. So I'd say in New York, they're solving the wrong problem. That's the biggest challenge, Lee. And to figure out a way to honor, I think, the spirit of the right to shelter, which is no one should be experiencing homelessness in New York, and to shift the energy to what do we have to do if we're prepared to spend $3.2 billion to actually keep people, from losing their homes in the first place, to quickly reconnect them to a stable place to live. So New York is like almost the mother of all system problems when it comes to homelessness. And also it's going to require just a really, I would say, something New York City is good at, really almost reframing this as the public health problem it is. And like, if we were serious and took responsibility for the brutal impacts of homelessness on people's health and mental health, and acted like this was the emergency it is, I think New York could rise to it. But right now, it's very much in compliance mode.
Yes, thank you for that very nuanced response. I recognize the city spends tons of money, and they just throw money into this problem, and it's just like a treadmill. I mean, the astronomical lack of accountability is just mind-blowing. But I won't go on and on.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And that's precisely what, we, communicate to folks, that what if homelessness isn't the problem we thought it was? Like, it's not a money problem, or people don't want help with housing. what if it's an accountability problem? Because like no one is in charge of solving it. And that really is where you need to begin, that shared aim and the intention and holding yourself accountable at a community level for working the problem down to zero.
Right, yes. Well, thank you. I'll just listen further. Thank you.
So we have another question. Anuya, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do you have a question for Roseanne?
Hi, Roseanne. Hi, my name is Anuja. Yes, I do have a question based on your slide deck that you showed and the data that you showed. In particular, I saw that when you're doing the data analysis on the inflow of the homeless that you see, I saw that there are people who are entering the system who have already been rehabilitated, but for some reason they lose their homes. I was just wondering, what are some of the reasons why people who have already been rehabilitated, they end up becoming homeless again?
Often, Anuj, it's that they needed support in addition to assistance with maybe paying the rent or finding housing. This is where maybe health or mental health issues needed to be supported in addition to having help finding a new home and paying for it. Another thing that is sometimes operative, and it's heartbreaking that when this happens is it doesn't happen a ton in Built for Zero communities, but I know friends in other communities point out that having systems that don't take into account the wishes of individuals, saying like, all right, you're homeless, here's a unit for you, take it or leave it. And like, it might be in a part of the community where they know no one, or they are so far from transportation that they can't get to their mental health clinic. And that's too often, I think, the cause of someone like not staying in a home, that they're too isolated, or they weren't given a choice about like what are the things that matter to them as far as being able to rebuild a life. And one of the crazy things that and terribly sad things that often happens in communities with those kind of very rigid rules that don't take into account what is important to an individual rebuilding his or her or their family's life, is like they'll end up back in the shelter system and told you had your chance, and so like they go back to the back of the line, and so that's sometimes the problem. But it's usually they needed more support for issues that had contributed to their homelessness in the first place, or there was not a good match with the housing.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So I was just wondering, like, if the problem of homelessness is also like sort of very intimately tied with unemployment and lack of education, right? Like you can get them a home, but if they're not able to sustain the home, they're back to, back on the streets. Mm-hmm. So, that's why maybe certain fractions of the population do better with homelessness. Like, I don't know, I haven't seen data, but probably veterans should do better because they have had an education, maybe even of a very particular kind. I'm just asking.
Yeah. What we found is, that homelessness, as I think I mentioned earlier, is almost too big a category. It's like saying we've got a sickness issue in our community. It's just like, what? Yeah, like, well, what kind? You have people like in an emergency room who have all sorts of things going on that landed them there. What they have in common is they're in a state of health emergency. And that's really true with people in a state of housing emergency. You could be someone who, had a very comfortable lifestyle and yet, was experienced domestic violence, or a very good family supports, but then there was a whole cascading series of events, a job loss, a health problem, and all of a sudden you're in this situation. And or someone who has had a lifetime of struggle with a mental health problem, or grew up in foster care and aged out at 18 without any kind of supports. All of these situations are true. And I'd say the common denominators tend to be certainly you're in financial distress, but you also your friend and family network has thinned out. Like there isn't like someone who can catch you at that moment, and there's been a crisis, like a health problem or an eviction or a job loss or a psychological break. So it's usually those things. Financial resources, no family or support network to turn to, and some immediate provocation.
Thanks a lot, Roseanne. That was very illuminating.
Roseanne, I have another question. You mentioned sort of throughout the presentation just how many players are involved within the community, sort of outreach, all these services. So I'm wondering if you think that in some ways homelessness might be profitable for some people in this system, or some services. Is that an issue or something you've come up against?
Well, it's an important question, Maura, because I mentioned New York, now spending $3.2 billion. That's a lot of organizations whose, livelihoods and activities, are engaged in kind of maintaining the homeless industrial complex, and so part of the work that needs to be done is like retraining, kind of reorienting the whole system. But there are lots of disincentives now baked into certain communities' homelessness response systems, where it becomes a moment of panic. It's just like, what? Fewer people experiencing homelessness? Not enough, not the same demand for my shelter beds. That should be a source of celebration, but we see communities that are like, oh no, and so you end up in a situation of the incentives having been misaligned for a long time, really good people doing earnest work, kind of being in the middle of this dilemma of what do we need to do to end homelessness, but also kind of create the next step and some transition for the work of organizations.
Yeah. And unless anyone else has any questions, I'm gonna just ask. Oh, let's see. We got someone in the chat. Robert, did you want to ask?
Yeah. So as thank you for the presentation, by the way. As like someone in the community, I'm wondering. Oh, sure. Hi.
Hi.
As like just someone like in the community, I'm wondering if there are sort of like opportunities to help or contribute. Because I would understand like, oh, there's like going to like work in a soup kitchen or things like that, like handiwork, which would be cool. But like I'm wondering, if it's tackling it as like a data-oriented issue, if there's something in kind of a research capacity that like a layman could do to contribute.
Well, where are you based, Robert?
New York City.
Okay. I honestly don't know in New York City who may be doing any work to really get at the, this powerful data on homelessness that can actually help, drive reductions. I do know a few researchers though, who are just doing incredibly important work, looking at, what you might need to do to shift incentives, and I can find out. Maybe I can share with Maura and Elaine and Bill the names of some of these researchers, and to see if there could be an opportunity to collaborate with them. Also, since we're all virtual now, our own data team is pretty extensive. I know we have some internship positions that are coming up this summer, but I can ask if there would be an opportunity to do some volunteer work there.
That sounds interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Lee, did you want to ask this last Other question, or do you want me to ask?
Yes, I can ask. So has the Community Solutions been in touch with anybody on a government level in New York or maybe even LA?
Yeah, we have certainly shared our information with lots of folks in LA and in New York. I think it's part of the problem, Lee, is because it's sort of no one's job. It's just like who's going to grab hold of it is one challenge. But yeah, no, we, especially with the change of administration and the new governor, we have been working with organizations, advocacy organizations, to make sure folks in New York realize that it doesn't have to be this way, and other cities, including large cities, are making progress. In LA, we just actually Pasadena, interestingly, just joined Built for Zero. LA has like 88 cities in the LA county, and all but I think 4 are part of one continuum of care, like one HUD funded entity, and we have had very little luck kind of getting any traction with the larger LA initiative. But Pasadena, one of those 4 communities that can operate a little bit more independently, has just joined Built for Zero. So we're excited that there will be at least an opportunity for others in the LA area to see how this whole system could actually operate differently.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, you're saying that in LA that there are too many municipalities to be able to kind of pull together. So,
well, it's LA County is a really complex environment, as you probably know. I think there are 88 different municipalities, including the city of LA, and all but 4 are part of this one entity in terms of how the money flows on homelessness. It's called the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. But there are 4 of those 88 communities that actually, for reasons I don't understand, but historically kind of separated themselves out from that. And so one of them is Pasadena. And so it'll be interesting to see if Pasadena adopting this approach becomes a way for officials across the county to realize that things could be different.
Right. That's what I was thinking, that because I've never heard of your organization before, and I had always been thinking there's something wrong here. I just knew that there was something wrong here. It's not like for lack of trying or lack of resources or money. Mm-hmm. There's something going on that I can't put my finger on, and and so that what you're saying makes total sense. Mm-hmm. And so my other question is, as like just a resident, just an ordinary citizen, is there anything that like I can do and others can do to maybe help, in general?
Yeah, well, one of the things that is absolutely, a real job to be done here, Lee, is tell other people that this actually is a solvable problem, that it's the accountability gap you spoke to. I think one of the biggest hurdles that anyone who knows this is a solvable problem is up against is disbelief. I mean, living in New York, you'd swear like this is never going to change. I'm being told all the time, like nothing to be done, and we're just going to throw more money at the problem. We need more people saying, wait a minute, this doesn't, as you say, this doesn't feel right. Like in what world does it make sense to keep throwing money at a problem and doing the same old thing and just see that that's acceptable? It actually, is going to require, I think, a communications strategy, which, we're still very much in the, like, what are the dimensions of this? But we need people to be spokespeople and in their networks and in their opportunities to, just kind of jog the status quo. So that's, and I'd be happy to share with you if you'd be interested, the names I'm going to put together for Robert and send to Maura. But I would really ask your help in just pushing back against this, this inaccurate story that it's about blaming the victim. It's like those people don't want help, or, there's nothing to be done. It's really about accountability.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah.
No, great.
Yeah, if you can share
the information,
that'd be great.
Roseanne, before we finish up here, I just wanted to piggyback sort of on what you and Lee had been talking about. And I feel like in our tech, you had mentioned, I just want to ask, while we have this group too at your disposal, if there were any sort of data career opportunities within community solutions or anything like that, because we seem to have an interested crowd here.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that, Maura. We, are always hiring. We've been expanding pretty steadily. But what also is happening is in like these 98 communities, they are so hungry for tech savvy staff, and because it's a missing skill and in many of the organizations that have been working on homelessness. And so especially with funds that cities have gotten through the American Recovery Act, and we won this big award last year, and we're actually helping to fund positions in cities, especially around like system change management, data analytics. So absolutely, if you're interested in being part of this work, check our website. It's community.solutions, and we'll whenever you'll see any position we have there. But over the next few months, we're in the midst of figuring this out now, like how to be more of a conduit for the staffing needs of communities.
Well, that sounds
I'm gonna put the website in. I don't want to do that. I'm gonna put their website in the chat so you guys can reference that. Thanks, Roseanne.
Well, thanks everyone for your interest.
Well, thank you so much. Really, I will definitely check out the website, and actually, I'm willing to offer my services for free. I didn't mention it, but I actually have a nonprofit for and trying to help people who are homeless. It's like sort of fledgling, and I realize I'm just like a penny in a bucket, And I have been thinking about it for a long time, and I realized that it's really research. We need research to understand what's going on, instead of just being like this cog in a wheel that just goes in doing the same thing over and over again.
Absolutely. Well, I think, Maura, you have my email address, and like if I can be helpful in connecting you, I'd be very happy to, Lee.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. And just so everyone knows, this recording will go out. We'll post it on the Meetup, and also will be available on YouTube if you want to reference anything or go back to anything. That'll be put out in about a week or so. And also keep an eye out for the next Data and the Greater Goods Meetup for March. There'll be info on that as well. And thanks so much to Roseanne for such a great talk and great conversation. So we really appreciate having you.
Yeah. Thanks for your interest. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.